Hey movie nerds! Today we're stepping into Itataya Ko ang Buhay Ko 1996, a 1996 romantic drama that explores sacrifice, resilience, and the fragile bonds that tether us to the ones we love, a story that asks us to look deeper, to question, and to feel beyond the surface. I'm glad you're here because together we'll unravel the hidden layers, the subtle details, and the little moments that whisper the heart of the film. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep exploring these stories that shape how we see the world. Now settle in, open your mind, and let's dive into the depths of this cinematic journey. In the earliest frames, the world feels broken, yet still vibrant. A woman's silhouette leans against a window, dawn light tracing her form with tender precision. Her eyes are fixed on something beyond the glass, not quite visible, either in distance or clarity, but full of longing. It's a moment weighted with quiet desperation, as if the promise of a new day hasn't yet reached her heart, and the promise of solitude resonates deeper. Slowly the camera retreats, revealing a small, modest apartment, walls thin with memory, floors worn smooth by the passage of time, every detail whispering of a life built in the quiet spaces between dreams and duty. This is where our journey begins. The story unfolds with the push of circumstances and the pull of love, with decisions shaped by necessity and unsettled emotions. We meet a woman whose life has been a constant balancing act. Caretaking, sacrifice, yearning for freedom, all wrapped in one delicate frame. When a man steps into her sphere, unassuming, steady, and disarmingly kind, there is a spark of something unexpected. Complicity in laughter, moments of comfort in shared silences, that flicker of possibility that gleams in mutual recognition. Their connection is slow, built of small gestures. The way he hesitates before offering a jacket, the way she softens behind a smile she doesn't mean to mask. Each glance, each paused breath is laden with meaning. But life, as life does, hums along outside the fragile orbit of affection. Shadows of the past creep in, obligations to family buried beneath love, debts that cannot be easily repaid, childhood wounds that crack open again when the night grows too long. The tone shifts subtly, laughter still curls around them, but beneath it lies tension, a quiet knowledge that one choice could upend everything. In one scene that stays with me, the woman stands in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with methodical care while distant laughter from a neighbor's radio drifts through the open window. The edge of her blade reflects both the early morning sun and an inner unease, suggesting that even in the most ordinary acts, their world is a stage for larger emotions. Then comes the turning point. A letter, a phone call, a confrontation that cuts into the rhythm of their days. It arrives not with cinematic fanfare, but with the soft rustle of paper or the crackle of a disconnecting call, but it feels seismic. Life's debts long deferred come due. She must choose, stay in the familiar confines of duty, or step into the uncertain promise of love. The stakes are whispered in a single scene. The man stands under a pallid street lamp, rain falling in thin streams around him. She stands in the doorway, hesitant, soaked by fate in ways neither of them can fully express. In that moment, their feelings tremble in the balance. And then, because love's path is rarely straight, complications emerge. There are people well-intentioned, stubborn, who see sacrifice not as submission but as strength, who speak in truths that bruise, in warnings that cut deeper than any blade. There are moments when she steps backward, trying to protect what she loves by holding it at arm's length, and there are moments when he reaches for her, unafraid to be vulnerable, risking the loneliness he guards in small, private ways. These ripples of conflict deepen the story's emotional current, turning simple longing into a dance of hesitation, trust, and fear. The film's pulse quickens as choices are made, confronted, regretted, and remade. In one electrifying early climax, she abandons a path she thought was inescapable, chasing after him into a downpour that turns the street into a shimmering mirror. Their reunion is not cliched. There are no sweeping declarations, only breath, relief, and the muted admission that nothing will be the same again. But their union is fragile, tested once more by forces that conspire against them. Illness, economic fracture, unanswered obligations. It's as if the universe itself is asking whether love is strong enough to hold when life pulls at its edges. And twist upon twist, the narrative weaves its quiet surprises. There's a reveal that changes everything, a long-buried secret that threads their stories together more deeply than either had suspected. A forgotten promise whispered in the past surfaces in a confrontation, and in that moment, what once seemed incidental becomes foundational. Our hearts lurch with them, understanding that salvation may come not from grand gestures, but from the courage to name what has been unspoken. There's a moment late in the film that still rides with me. The woman, seated at a small cafe table bleached by the afternoon sun, stirring sugar into coffee with deliberate slowness. Across from her he watches, small lines of concern etched in his brow. Then she looks up, and all the determination in the world is in her glance. She knows what she wants, not just the promise of a life together, but the freedom to claim it in full, not half-hidden behind excuses or compromise. It's not melodrama, it's pure, unassuming truth. The final sequence sweeps us forward without melodrama. We follow them walking side by side on a quiet street, the city's bustle a chorus around them, neither pursued nor escaping. He brushes a trace of hair from her face. She rests a hand on his shoulder with an unspoken acknowledgement. Their steps fall in rhythm, not because the path ahead is clear, but because they have chosen to face it together. The frame widens until their silhouettes are small, stitched into a tapestry of dawn, street lamps, and distant traffic, a quiet testament to the way love and longing shape even the humblest of horizons. What stays with you long after the credits roll are the silences that cradle the speeches yet to be spoken, the unsent letters gathering dust in their minds, the moment when two hearts close enough to feel each other's breath must decide. Is love enough to risk everything? The film whispers its answer through smiles that tremble with vulnerability, through glances that echo with unvoiced desire. And in that lie the gifts of this story, not in spectacle, but in honesty. So now that we've unfolded this tale, its small gestures, its tremors of longing, its quiet revelations, its emotional crescendo, I hope you feel the echo of its pulse. It asks us without ever shouting what we would risk for love, for truth, for the chance to say, this is my life, and I stake it on what I choose. And that is a question worth sitting with, long after the screen goes dark. That's it for now, and if this story stirred something in you, stay with me. There are more films waiting to be felt, more stories whispered in light and shadow, just beneath the surface. It opens on a Manila morning that feels half awake, the air still heavy with the residue of the night before. The streets hum with their usual unhurried chaos, vendors setting up shop, jeepneys rattling through narrow lanes, children darting between doorways with laughter trailing behind them. In a small apartment above a hardware store, a woman sits by the window, her hands resting idly in her lap. She is not idle by nature, but this is one of those moments when the weight of what's to come stills every instinct to move. The light on her face is pale, filtered through thin curtains that sway slightly with the occasional breeze. There's something in her eyes, not sadness exactly, but the kind of watchfulness that belongs to someone used to calculating her next step before she takes it. Her name is whispered before it's spoken, by neighbors who call up from the street, by the clatter of dishes in the hallway kitchen, by the familiar rustle of envelopes sliding under the door. She picks one up without looking at the sender, the paper thin enough to let her feel the folded edges of whatever lies inside. Her fingers hesitate, then open it. A few words, plain and direct, are enough to shift her breathing. She folds the letter again, tucks it into her bag, and stands. The day has begun. Her world is one built on routine. She helps her younger sister prepare for work, fusses over the old man next door who insists on carrying heavy water jugs himself, and stops by the market to pick up vegetables, knowing exactly which vendor will give her the freshest without asking for extra payment. It's in these small motions that we see her skill for survival, nothing wasted, nothing given away carelessly. But beneath the efficiency lies a tension, a quiet readiness for something that hasn't yet shown itself. It arrives in the most unassuming way when she meets him. Their first exchange happens in the cramped space between two stalls, where she's trying to navigate the crowd with an armful of greens, and he's leaning on a wooden crate, talking to a friend. She bumps him by accident. He steadies her without comment, but the briefest hint of a smile flickers across his face. It's a moment so fleeting she might have dismissed it, except that she catches him looking after her as she walks away. Their paths cross again, this time in the doorway of the shop where she's making a delivery. He's there for something else entirely, but he offers a greeting as though they already know each other. There's no urgency in his voice, no push, just an openness that feels out of place in the wary rhythm of her days. They speak in fragments, each sentence measured, yet there's an ease to it that surprises her. By the time they part, something unspoken has been set in motion. The days that follow bring more of these encounters, small threads weaving themselves into her life. He starts to wait for her at the market, helping carry her purchases to the jeepney stop. Sometimes they walk together, talking about nothing in particular, street food vendors they both like, the ridiculous price of fish that week, the way the city changes after a rainstorm. But there's a subtle pull beneath it all, a sense that each of them is quietly testing the edges of trust. Her family notices before she's ready to admit anything. Her sister teases her lightly, but there's an undercurrent of caution in the way she asks about him. The woman brushes it off, unwilling to put shape to something so new, but we can see it in the way she lingers at the window in the evenings now, watching the street with the half-expectation of seeing him pass by. One evening, he invites her to a small cafe tucked behind a busy corner. It's not the sort of place she usually goes, too exposed, too much room for people to see. But she agrees, and they sit in a quiet booth with chipped paint and mismatched chairs, talking long after their coffee has cooled. Here, his guarded humor gives way to something more earnest. He tells her about his work, about the people he supports, about the debts, emotional and otherwise, that have shaped his choices. She listens without judgment, and when she shares pieces of her own story, he listens in return, as though he's collecting them carefully. There's a moment during that conversation when she looks at him and sees, clearly, how easily she could care for him. It's not the rush of infatuation, it's steadier than that, like recognizing a song you've known for years. But she also sees the risk in it, the way love can unbalance everything she's built to keep herself safe. That risk starts to press in when the past she's tried to keep at a distance begins to close the gap. An old acquaintance, a man with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, appears at her door. His visit is brief, but the implication is clear. Something she thought she'd left behind isn't finished with her yet. He speaks in half-threats, wrapped in the guise of advice, reminding her of debts unpaid and favors that can't be ignored. She listens quietly, but after he leaves, she sits at her table for a long time, the letter from that morning still folded in her bag. When she sees the man again, she doesn't mention it. Instead, they walk along the quieter streets, away from the crush of the market. He senses the weight on her but doesn't push. Instead, he tells her about the time he almost left the city for good, about the moment he decided to stay and fight for the life he wanted. His words aren't advice exactly, but they stay with her, echoing long after they part. The first real shift in their story comes on a night heavy with rain. She's running late from an errand, the streets slick and shining under the dim glow of street lamps. When she rounds the corner to her building, she finds him there, waiting. He's soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, but his expression is steady. He tells her he's heard things, rumors that circle fast in neighborhoods like theirs, and that if there's trouble coming, he wants to know. She doesn't answer right away, but the fact that he's standing there, unflinching in the downpour, says more than words could. Inside, over steaming mugs of tea, she tells him just enough. About the man from her past, about the obligations that never really went away. He listens without interruption, though a shadow crosses his face when she admits how deeply those obligations could cut into her present. When she finishes, he says only that she doesn't have to face it alone. It's a promise she didn't expect, and it lands somewhere deep inside her. From then on, the tension hums beneath every scene. They continue their routines, the market trips, the cafe visits, but there's an unspoken awareness that their time in this fragile calm is running out. She begins to make quiet preparations, not out of fear exactly, but out of a desire to be ready. He, too, starts asking questions in places she doesn't know about, tracing the edges of the threat without telling her everything he's learned. Then comes the call that forces the next step. Late one afternoon, as she's closing up her shop, the phone rings. The voice on the other end is familiar, unwelcome. It's an invitation dressed as a demand: meet at a certain place, bring nothing but yourself, and don't be late. She hangs up without answering, but the choice is already circling her mind. She could go alone and keep him out of it, or she could tell him and risk drawing him into something dangerous. That evening they meet as planned, but she says nothing about the call. Instead, she talks about the weather, about her sister's plans for the weekend, about anything but the truth. He watches her carefully, sensing the avoidance but choosing not to press for now. It's in this fragile space between what's said and what's withheld that the story deepens. Every glance, every small act of care, feels weighted with the knowledge that the balance they've found is temporary, and somewhere in the city, the pieces that will shatter that balance are already moving into place. The air feels different now, thicker, as though the city itself is holding its breath. In the quiet of her room, she sits on the edge of the bed with the phone resting in her hands, not ringing, not speaking, yet still heavy with what was said the day before. The call lingers like smoke, impossible to wave away. Outside, Manila moves in its usual rhythm, horns blaring, street vendors shouting, but she's not hearing it. The words replay in her head over and over until they feel like they've carved themselves into her skin. When she steps outside that morning, her eyes scan every face in the street. It's instinct now, searching for the wrong expression, the too long glance, the man lingering where he shouldn't be. She keeps her steps purposeful, but there's a new edge to them, like someone walking just a little faster through a dark alley. She doesn't notice that he's been following from a distance, watching her just long enough to confirm the suspicion he's been carrying. Something has shifted, and she's hiding it. It's later, in the cramped back room of the cafe where they've always met, that he decides not to wait any longer. The place is half empty, a drizzle tapping softly against the awning outside. He leans across the table, voice low but steady, and asks her directly what's going on. She looks away at first, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup, but he doesn't fill the silence with comfort. He waits, giving her no escape from the weight of the question. Eventually she tells him, not everything but enough. The man from her past is just here to talk. There are things owed, things she can't repay, and he's given her a deadline that's running out fast. He listens without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finishes, he exhales slowly, as if absorbing the enormity of it. Then he tells her something she didn't expect. He knows who the man is. More than that, he's dealt with him before, seen the way he operates, the way his promises are always barbed hooks. It's a connection she never guessed at, and it changes the weight of the air between them. For a moment, neither of them speaks, both aware that their histories are more entangled than they'd thought. From that moment on, he takes a more deliberate role in her days. He begins walking her home in the evenings, not in the casual way he once did, but with the alertness of someone scanning for trouble. She tries to tell him she doesn't want him involved, but he shakes his head. If the man is coming for her, he's already involved. His stubbornness both comforts and terrifies her. She knows what people like this can do, and the thought of him standing in their way makes her stomach tighten. The meeting, when it comes, feels inevitable. It's not in a dimly lit alley or a shadowed corner of the city. It's in broad daylight, in a busy marketplace where the noise of commerce drowns out the tension in their voices. The man from her past stands in front of a fruit stall, peeling a mango with a small knife, as though it's the most natural thing in the world. He smiles when he sees her, but it's the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He greets her like an old friend, making no mention of the weight in his words. Then he notices the man beside her, and the smile changes, tighter, sharper. Their exchange is cordial on the surface, but underneath there's a current of unspoken threats. The man reminds her, in a voice just loud enough to be heard over the hum of the market, that she has until the end of the week. Then he walks away, leaving behind the scent of mango and the faint metallic tang of unease. She doesn't realize she's been holding her breath until he's gone. After that, the days blur into a kind of suspended tension. She tries to keep life going as normal, helping her sister, working, stopping by the cafe, but every conversation feels half-lived, her mind always turning over the same impossible calculations. He spends those days trying to find leverage, someone who owes him a favor, someone who can put pressure on the man from her past. But each lead runs into a wall. The man's reach is wider than they thought. The deadline approaches. On the last night before it runs out, she can't sleep. She sits by the window, the city lights flickering against her face, and writes a letter she never plans to send. It's not to him, not to the man who's been protecting her, it's to herself. She writes about what she wants, what she's willing to lose, what she can't bear to give up. When she finishes, she folds the paper and tucks it under her pillow, as if keeping it close will give her strength in the morning. Morning comes with a sky heavy and gray. She leaves the apartment before dawn, not telling her sister where she's going. The streets are quieter than usual, and her footsteps sound louder than they should. She heads toward the place the man from her past named in his call, a warehouse near the docks, its walls streaked with rust, its windows clouded with years of salt air. He's already there when she arrives. He's leaning against the hood of a car, hands in his pockets, the calm of someone who knows he has the upper hand. They talk in low voices, though there's nothing gentle in their tone. He lays out what he wants, payment in full, not in money, but in something harder to give. Information access, a favor that will put her in danger far beyond this meeting. She refuses at first, but he reminds her of the people who will pay if she doesn't. What neither of them sees is the figure watching from across the street. He followed her from the moment she left home, staying far enough back to avoid notice. When he realizes where she's headed, he moves in closer, every step measured. He waits until the man from her past is distracted, then steps into view. The confrontation that follows is quieter than one might expect. There's no shouting, no grand fight, just the cold, clipped rhythm of two men who know exactly what the other is capable of. Words are exchanged, some of them sharp enough to cut without a blade. Then, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifts. The man from her past realizes that whatever hold he thought he had is not as unshakable as he believed. The man beside her has found a thread, something from long ago that the other cannot afford to have pulled into the light. It's enough to force a retreat, but not a clean one. The man from her past leaves with a warning. This isn't over, and debts like hers don't disappear. They only change shape, but for now she's free. The tension in her shoulders eases, though she knows it's only a temporary reprieve. In the days that follow, the rhythm of life tries to return. She walks to the market without scanning every face, sits at the cafe without glancing at the door every few seconds. But something in her has shifted. She's more deliberate now, more certain about the spaces she chooses to occupy. He notices it, and though he doesn't say so, there's a quiet pride in the way he looks at her. The final act of their story comes not with another confrontation, but with a choice. He offers her a way out, an escape from the city, from the lingering shadow of the man who threatened her. It would mean leaving behind everything she knows, but it would also mean safety. She thinks about it for days, weighing every possibility. When she finally gives her answer, it's not what he expects. She tells him she's staying. Not because she wants to tempt fate, but because she's done running from her own life. If trouble comes again, she'll face it with him, if he's willing. There's a long silence between them, the kind that says more than words could. Then he nods, the faintest curve of a smile tugging at his mouth. The closing scene mirrors the opening in some ways, the two of them walking through the streets of Manila, the day just beginning. The light is different now, warmer, less hesitant. They move in step, not as people caught in the middle of someone else's story, but as two who have claimed their own. And somewhere in the city's endless hum, the past is still out there, but for now, it's behind them. She moves through the story with the quiet discipline of someone who has lived her life in negotiation with the world. From the first time we see her by the window, she gives the impression of a person who knows exactly how much of herself she can afford to show. Her posture, her measured pace, the way her eyes scan her surroundings without seeming to, these are not habits learned in comfort. They are the survival instincts of someone who has learned that vulnerability, once given freely, can be used as leverage. And yet beneath that composure, there is warmth. It's not immediately visible to everyone, but it's there in the way she helps her sister button the last loop on her blouse before work, or in the way she quietly leaves a portion of her own meal for the elderly neighbor who always forgets to cook. Her kindness is deliberate, never careless, extended only to those who will respect it. She is not naive. She knows that the city can take as much as it gives, and so she offers herself in pieces, not all at once. Her past has shaped her into this, past debts, past betrayals, past ties that have never truly been severed. She carries them the way one carries a scar, not hiding them exactly, but never inviting others to trace them with their fingers. In the early parts of the story, this guardedness defines her interactions. When she first meets him, her responses are cautious, her smiles tentative, as though she's watching herself from the outside to make sure she isn't giving away more than she intends. But it's also clear that some part of her is tired of living in that constant state of watchfulness. The slow easing of her shoulders, the subtle unhurriedness in her voice when she speaks to him, these are signs of a person allowing herself to remember what trust feels like. He, in turn, is a different kind of guarded. His caution isn't in withholding emotion, but in revealing the full scope of what he's capable of. At first, he appears almost unremarkable, grounded, present, always ready with a small, wry observation about whatever's in front of them. But there's an underlying stillness to him, a kind of control that feels like it could shift into action at a moment's notice. He carries his own history in silence, not because he's hiding it out of shame, but because he's learned the value of speaking only when the timing matters. With her, he shows a side of himself that others might not see, patience, attentiveness, and an instinct to protect without overshadowing. In their early conversations, he never pushes for more than she's willing to give. He reads her silences not as refusals but as boundaries, and he respects them. This mutual understanding forms the foundation of their relationship, two people who have learned to live carefully, finding in each other a reason to loosen that grip, if only slightly. Her sister exists on the periphery of the main conflict, yet she is vital to understanding the central figure. Where the protagonist is measured and deliberate, the sister is open-faced and impulsive, her emotions worn plainly where others can see. The contrast between them is sharp, and it's in these differences that we understand the choices the protagonist has made. Protectiveness runs deep here, not just in the sense of shielding her sister from the immediate dangers of the world, but in insulating her from the emotional weight of debts and obligations that could easily spill over. The man from her past is perhaps the clearest embodiment of the threats she has spent her life preparing for. He is charming when he chooses to be, and there's an unsettling ease in the way he wields familiarity as a weapon. His presence disrupts her life not because he appears suddenly, but because he reminds her of the version of herself that was still vulnerable to being cornered. In his words, every courtesy is edged with warning. In his smile, every warmth is undercut by ownership. He is not a simple villain. His power lies not in overt cruelty, but in his ability to convince others that resistance is futile. Between these forces, the man who offers her stability and the man who threatens to undo it, she is caught in a test of self-definition. The heart of her arc is not only about choosing who to trust, but also about deciding who she will be when trust is no longer a gamble she can avoid. The cafe itself becomes almost a character in its own right, a neutral ground where the boundaries between them are negotiated. Here, she lets slip pieces of her history, and he offers glimpses of his own, stories told in tones that suggest there's more left unsaid. The cramped booths, the soft clink of cups, the muted conversations in the background, all of it creates a space where the stakes are lowered just enough for honesty to feel possible. In the second half of the story, when the pressure mounts, their dynamic shifts subtly. She becomes more assertive, not in loud defiance, but in the quiet refusal to be dictated to. The meeting at the docks is a turning point, not because it resolves everything, but because it forces her to stand in the open with her fears, instead of maneuvering around them. Her willingness to face the man from her past head-on signals a break from the patterns that have kept her safe but limited. For him, this is the moment his own restraint gives way. Up until now, he has operated on the edges, positioning himself to be there when she needs him without inserting himself too far into the heart of her troubles. At the docks, he steps fully into the conflict, leveraging his own history to protect her. It's a calculated risk, but one he accepts without hesitation. In doing so, he reveals a side of himself she has only suspected until now, the capacity to fight when the cause is personal. By the time the final scenes arrive, both have been altered, not into entirely new people, but into versions of themselves that carry more of their own weight openly. She no longer moves through the streets with her head bent and her eyes constantly scanning. Instead, she walks with an awareness that feels less like fear and more like readiness. He still watches, still protects, but with a trust in her ability to stand alongside him rather than behind him. The man from her past remains a shadow, his threats unresolved but diminished. He's been forced to retreat, and in that retreat, his influence over her has weakened. The danger he represents is not gone, but her relationship to it has changed. He no longer holds the power to dictate her choices. He is simply another current in the city's tide, one she can navigate rather than be swept away by. Together, they form a pair defined not by grand declarations, but by the quiet steadiness of shared steps. Their bond is built from the accumulation of small moments, a hand offered in the rain, a silence held without discomfort, a decision made in unspoken agreement. In a world where both have learned to be careful, they've chosen to let each other in, even if only by degrees. And in that choice lies the core of their transformation. Every character around them, the sister, the neighbors, the vendors, even the nameless figures in the market, serves as a reminder of the life they are part of, the community that frames their private battles. These peripheral figures ground the story, showing that the stakes of their choices ripple outward, touching lives beyond their own. In the end, what makes them compelling is not the scale of the conflict they face, but the way they carry themselves through it. She is a woman who has learned to turn caution into strength, and he is a man who has learned to turn restraint into action. Together, they are not unbreakable, but they are unafraid of being broken. That more than any victory is what defines them when the story closes. Two people who have decided that the life they want is worth the risk of living it openly, side by side. Long before a single scene was shot, the story was already wrapped in a peculiar kind of energy, the kind of restless undercurrent that tends to follow films that arrive at the wrong time and the right time all at once. The director, a man known for crafting gritty street dramas, had been nursing the concept for years, scribbling fragments of dialogue on napkins during long nights at roadside cafes. He carried the seed of the film in his head through other projects, waiting for a moment when both budget and cast could align. When that moment finally came, it brought with it a cascade of oddities that would leave crew members shaking their heads for years afterward. One of the earliest quirks appeared during the location scouting phase. The script demanded a mix of bustling urban chaos and quieter, almost claustrophobic corners, places where the city seemed to fold in on itself. The production team found their primary market setting in a neighborhood that was, quite literally, invisible on official maps at the time. It wasn't an oversight. Locals claimed the area had been left off by mistake years earlier and had never been reinstated. This meant the production could shoot there without much bureaucratic interference, but it also meant the crew had to rely entirely on local contacts to navigate the warren of stalls and backstreets. Every day, runners had to guide actors and equipment through a shifting maze of vendors who operated without fixed spots, leading to the bizarre ritual of morning searches to locate their set. The cafe where some of the most pivotal conversations take place was another unexpected find. Originally, the team had planned to construct the interior on a soundstage. But during a scouting walk one afternoon, an assistant director stumbled upon a tiny establishment tucked behind a row of repair shops. The owner, an elderly man with a fondness for vintage radios, agreed to let them use it, on the condition that his collection of radios remain untouched. This became both a challenge and a gift. Sound technicians had to work around the occasional burst of static from an old transistor set that the owner insisted on keeping plugged in, even during takes. Rather than fight it, the director decided to weave that interference into the film's sound design, subtly using it to punctuate moments of tension. There was also the matter of the weather, an unpredictable character in its own right. Several key scenes were meant to unfold in light rain, with the atmosphere carrying that reflective, glistening quality the director loved. The crew had prepared for artificial rain rigs, but on the first scheduled rain scene, an actual storm swept in with uncanny timing, delivering exactly the look they wanted. The problem was that it didn't stop. For 3 straight days, the rain poured, forcing the team to completely rearrange the shooting schedule. This would have been a nightmare for continuity, but somehow the director found a way to stitch the downpour into the narrative, using it as a visual motif for the growing pressure in the characters' lives. The irony, when they finally needed rain for a later scene, the skies stayed stubbornly clear, and they had to rent expensive rigs after all. Perhaps the strangest on-set event happened during the filming of the warehouse sequence near the docks. The crew had secured the location weeks in advance, but when they arrived for the first night shoot, they discovered that a section of the building was still being used by a group of local fishermen to store gear. This was not part of any agreement, and the crew prepared for a lengthy negotiation. Instead, the fishermen, after watching a few takes, became invested in the story and offered to help with the set dressing. They brought in their own nets, crates, and weathered tools, lending the scene an authenticity the art department could never have fabricated. One of these borrowed props, a battered wooden stool, ended up in the background of multiple shots, becoming an unplanned but memorable visual link between scenes. The cast also faced their share of peculiar challenges. The lead actress, known for her controlled and internal style, was unexpectedly thrown off during a market scene when a street vendor, not realizing a film was being shot, began an enthusiastic pitch to sell her a bag of mangoes. Instead of breaking character, she responded in the tone of her role, declining politely while subtly folding the interruption into the moment. The director loved it so much that he kept the exchange in the final cut. It became one of those blink-and-you-miss-it touches that added to the film's lived-in realism. In contrast, the lead actor's most unusual moment came during the dock confrontation. The script called for him to hold a long, unbroken gaze with the antagonist, but a stray dog wandered into the frame mid-take, pausing directly between them. Both actors maintained their intensity, ignoring the animal completely. When the dog finally trotted away, the tension in the air was even thicker, and the director declared it perfect. No one ever found out where the dog came from. It wasn't a stray the crew had seen before or after that night. Then there was the matter of the letter. A recurring prop in the film, it had to be handled in multiple scenes, folded and unfolded, passed between characters, and even exposed briefly to rain. The prop master made 6 copies, but the actress insisted on using the same one for every take, saying it helped her connect with the emotional weight of the object. This created a minor disaster when, during one particularly damp night shoot, the ink began to run. The next morning, the art department painstakingly restored the original text by hand, using old stills from earlier takes as reference. Production delays also gave rise to strange superstitions among the crew. A string of small mishaps, camera batteries failing without explanation, a generator cutting out moments before a crucial take, and one particularly eerie instance where an audio track recorded nothing but static, led to whispers that the unmarked neighborhood where they'd been shooting was jinxed. The director brushed it off, but he did start wearing the same shirt for all exterior shoots in that area, claiming it was for continuity. Whether or not it was, no one could deny that things ran more smoothly after that. Even the soundtrack carried its own odd story. One track, used during a quiet walking sequence, was composed almost entirely from sounds recorded on location: the hum of an electric fan in the cafe, the distant call of a street vendor, the rhythm of rain against a tin roof. The composer, fascinated by these textures, layered them into a subtle melody that most viewers never consciously notice. Yet for those who do, it feels like the city itself is singing under the scene. One of the film's final scenes, the quiet street walk at dawn, nearly didn't happen. It had been scheduled for the last day of shooting, but heavy traffic noise threatened to ruin the atmosphere. In a rare stroke of luck, a sudden power outage in the neighborhood silenced much of the city's usual din for just under an hour. The crew rushed to capture the scene, and the resulting stillness lent it the hushed intimacy that made it so memorable. When the film finally wrapped, the the cast and crew gathered for a small celebration in the very cafe that had become their unofficial home. The owner, who had been gruffly indifferent at the start, gave a short toast about how the film had brought good noise to the place. In a strange twist, the cafe saw a surge of visitors in the months after the film's release, fans who wanted to sit in the same booth where the leads had spoken their most revealing lines. Looking back, the production was a tapestry of planned precision and unpredictable chaos. The strangest facts, the unmapped market, the stubborn radios, the unplanned rain, the mysterious dog, are woven into the fabric of the film so completely that it's hard to imagine the story without them. They are reminders that sometimes, the soul of a movie isn't just in the script or the performances, but in the odd, unrepeatable moments that happen when the camera is rolling and life decides to join in uninvited. And in this case, those moments didn't just join the story, they became part of its heartbeat, pulsing quietly under every frame, waiting for anyone curious enough to notice. From its very first shot, the film frames itself as something more than a simple urban drama. It opens with a stillness that feels deceptive, light spilling through gauzy curtains, the lead framed in a moment of quiet observation, only for that calm to reveal itself as the edge of an emotional undertow. This is the first significant event in the film, though it's deceptively small. Critics who have revisited it often point out how the opening sequence accomplishes in seconds what exposition-heavy scripts spend half an hour on. It tells us who this woman is without a single explanatory line. The muted colors, the deliberate camera linger on her hands, the way she shifts her gaze between the outside world and something just out of frame. It all builds a portrait of someone who exists between watchfulness and yearning. From a thematic standpoint, this opening moment is the seed from which the film's primary tension grows, the collision between survival and desire. In Filipino cinema of the 1990s, especially in the urban set dramas, the question of whether one can choose freely or must live reactively was a recurring motif. This scene situates the protagonist firmly in that conversation. Her world is already alive with small pressures, though they're unspoken. The audience senses that these will grow into the central conflicts long before the first overt plot turn appears. The early encounters between her and the man who will become her anchor are another focal point for critical discussion. Their first meeting in the cramped market aisle is staged like a near accident, but the blocking and framing tell a different story. Two figures moving in opposite directions, both surrounded by bustling anonymity, yet somehow aware of one another the instant they make contact. Here, the film resists melodramatic beats. It doesn't force the moment into a romantic cliché. Instead, it lets the scene breathe, making their connection feel like a natural emergence from the noise of daily life. Many critics have praised this choice, noting that by keeping the spark understated, the eventual weight of their bond feels earned rather than engineered. One of the most discussed sequences in the film is the first cafe conversation. On the surface, it's a simple mid-story respite, a break from the market's chaos. But in terms of narrative architecture, it's the moment the audience is allowed into the interior worlds of both characters. The way the scene is shot, tight frames on faces, warm ambient tones, a gentle rhythm to the edits, draws viewers into the intimacy of the space. There's a vulnerability in the way she tells pieces of her history, in how he listens without rushing to fill the silences. For some critics, this scene is the emotional foundation of the film, the point at which the stakes shift from external survival to the internal risk of letting someone else in. The arrival of the man from her past marks the story's first major rupture. His sudden presence changes the tonal register of the film, introducing a tension that doesn't fade even in his absence. Thematically, he is less a person than a manifestation of her unresolved past, the part of her life that refuses to be left behind. The script is careful never to render him in one dimension. He's charismatic enough to unsettle, calculating enough to pose a genuine threat. Critics have drawn attention to how the film frames him physically, often in spaces where he appears to block doorways or hallways, subtly reinforcing his role as an obstacle. The camera treats him as a disruption in space, not just in plot. The dockside meeting between him and the couple is perhaps the film's most studied event. This sequence strips away the bustling life that has framed most of the story, replacing it with emptiness. A vast open space with only the tide, the warehouses, and the echo of footsteps. The emptiness amplifies the tension. There's nowhere to hide, no crowd to absorb the danger. Critics often cite this scene as the film's moral crucible. Here, the male lead steps fully into the conflict, revealing that his role in her life is not just that of a supportive presence but of an active shield. His knowledge of the antagonist's history, hinted at in earlier conversations, comes into sharp focus, shifting the balance of power without a single punch thrown. From a critical perspective, this confrontation works because it avoids the trap of spectacle. The power dynamic shifts through words, through pauses, through the smallest flickers of reaction on the actors' faces. In a decade when many local dramas resolved their conflicts with either violent catharsis or overwrought moralizing, this choice to hold back feels quietly radical. The resolution is partial. The antagonist retreats but not in defeat. This ambiguity is central to the film's impact, leaving audiences with a sense that life's threats aren't neatly erased, only managed. Another key event, less dramatic but equally resonant, is the writing of the letter. Alone in her room, late at night, she writes not to another person but to herself. This moment doesn't advance the external plot, yet it deepens the thematic core of the film. It's an act of reclaiming narrative control. She puts into words the truths she cannot speak aloud, defining her desires and boundaries for her own understanding. Critics who admire the film's restraint often point to this scene as an example of how the filmmakers prioritize emotional authenticity over narrative expediency. By letting the audience witness her unguarded self-reflection, the film affirms that the true arc here is internal, not just situational. The final walk through the quiet streets at dawn serves as both visual and emotional resolution. It echoes the film's opening, but the shift in tone is unmistakable. Where the first scene framed her in isolation, the last frames them together, their steps in sync, the city waking around them. It's not a triumphant ending. There's no sweeping score or sense that all has been resolved, but it's grounded in the recognition that survival has given way to a kind of chosen living. The light in the scene is warmer, softer, almost forgiving. Critics have called it one of the most honest endings in the genre, precisely because it doesn't overpromise. It suggests that while danger may return, so too will the capacity to face it. Reception of the film at the time reflected this tension between audience expectation and narrative intent. Some viewers, accustomed to more definitive resolutions, found the ambiguity unsatisfying. But others embraced it, praising the film for reflecting the messy realities of life in a city where past and present constantly intersect. For many, the lack of a clean break from the antagonist felt true to lived experience, the understanding that certain threats never truly disappear, but that one can learn to live without being defined by them. From an emotional standpoint, the film resonates because it doesn't simply tell a story of love or survival, it tells a story of integration. The lead character doesn't erase her past, she absorbs it into a stronger sense of self. The man at her side doesn't save her, he stands with her, making her choice to stay a shared one. The antagonistic presence doesn't vanish, it fades into the background noise of life, still there but no longer in control. This layered resolution has made the film a touchstone for discussions about agency in Filipino cinema, particularly for female leads, whose arcs traditionally ended in either tragic sacrifice or total rescue. Looking back, the critical consensus seems to agree on one thing: the film's lasting power comes from its refusal to bow to formula. Its significant events, those market meetings, that cafe conversation, the tense dockside exchange, the quiet letter writing, the dawn walk, each carry more weight than they appear to at first glance. They function as both plot markers and thematic signposts, guiding the audience through a story that is less about defeating an antagonist than about redefining the protagonist's relationship to herself and her world. And this is why, even decades later, the film continues to be revisited, not for its twists or its climax alone, but for the way it asks its audience to find meaning in the spaces between. The events are significant not only because of what happens in them, but because of how they change the air around the characters, and how, by the final frame, they've changed the air around us too. It began, as many films do, not with a full script but with a feeling. The director had carried this feeling for years, an image of a woman standing at a window at dawn, the light touching her face as though it had something to say. That image was the nucleus of the entire project, and before a single line of dialogue was written, before budgets were discussed or schedules drafted, he knew that everything else in the story would have to grow from that solitary moment. Pre-production was as much an act of detective work as it was of filmmaking. The script called for spaces that felt both lived in and layered with invisible histories, the market that breathed with a life of its own, the cafe where the world seemed to shrink to two people's voices, the narrow streets that could turn intimate or threatening depending on the light. The location scouts went through dozens of neighborhoods, but the director rejected most of them for being too polished or too stage-looking. What he wanted were places that carried the textures of time, peeling paint, uneven floors, signs that had been repaired so many times they were a collage of past designs. Finding the market was an odyssey in itself. It wasn't on any official location list because, as the scouts discovered, the place didn't technically exist in municipal records. It was a self-organized network of vendors who had been there for decades, expanding and contracting with the seasons, setting up their stalls wherever space allowed. This meant there were no fixed walkways, no predictable stall arrangements. Every morning the market reinvented itself. The crew had to arrive early each shoot day to find their section, and sometimes the background would shift between takes because a vendor decided to move a table or pack up early. What could have been a continuity nightmare turned into an asset. The natural movement and unpredictability gave the scenes a vibrancy that no set designer could replicate. The cafe location was an equally serendipitous find. Originally, the production team had planned to build it from scratch on a soundstage for better control over lighting and sound. But one afternoon, while taking a shortcut to another scouting location, the assistant director ducked into a small, dimly lit establishment to escape the midday heat. The smell of brewed coffee and the faint crackle of an old transistor radio caught his attention. When the owner mentioned that the cafe hadn't changed much in 30 years, the team knew they'd found something special. The owner agreed to rent it to the production, but only under one condition: none of his vintage radios were to be unplugged or moved. This posed a challenge for the sound department. Static bursts would sometimes creep into the audio during takes, but instead of fighting it, the director embraced it, integrating those interruptions into the soundscape of the film. Weather became both a collaborator and an adversary. The script had several scenes set during light rain, meant to mirror the character's sense of uncertainty and vulnerability. The production had budgeted for rain rigs, but on the first day they needed rain, the sky delivered in abundance, so much so that the actors had to shout over the sound of water hammering on tin roofs. That natural downpour was visually perfect, but it forced the team to shuffle their shooting schedule for 3 days. Later, when they actually needed rain for a key emotional scene, the skies stayed relentlessly clear, and the rain rigs had to be brought in at significant expense. The cinematographer later joked that the weather was like an unpredictable actor, sometimes brilliant, sometimes stubborn, and always demanding to be accommodated. The warehouse near the docks provided another lesson in the unpredictability of location shooting. The crew had secured it weeks in advance, believing it was empty, but on the first night shoot, they discovered it was still being used by a group of local fishermen to store their gear. This could have been a disaster, but instead, it became one of the production's most charming behind-the-scenes stories. The fishermen, curious about the film, ended up lending their own nets, crates, and weather-worn stools to the set. One of those stools appears in multiple shots, becoming an accidental visual thread that even the most attentive viewers might not consciously notice. The actors found themselves navigating these organic, sometimes chaotic environments in ways that demanded improvisation. In one memorable instance, during a market scene, a real street vendor, unaware of the cameras, approached the lead actress and began trying to sell her a bag of mangoes. She stayed completely in character, politely declining while continuing the scripted conversation. The director loved the authenticity of the moment and kept it in the final cut. It's a fleeting exchange, but for viewers who catch it, it adds to the film's sense of lived reality. The male lead's most unexpected moment came during the dock confrontation scene. The tension was high, the cameras were rolling, and then, out of nowhere, a stray dog wandered into the frame, stopping right between him and the antagonist. Instead of breaking character, both actors ignored the animal entirely, maintaining their focus. The dog eventually trotted off, and the scene continued seamlessly. Watching the playback later, the director decided the interruption actually enhanced the scene, adding an almost surreal tension to the already fraught exchange. Props became their own quiet dramas. The letter, central to several emotional beats, was supposed to have multiple duplicates for continuity, but the lead actress became attached to one particular copy, insisting it was the only one she could use because it felt lived in from being folded and unfolded so many times. This worked fine until a damp night shoot caused the ink to bleed. The next day, the art department painstakingly recreated the original handwriting, using still photographs from earlier scenes as reference. Superstitions also crept into the production. After a string of small technical mishaps, a generator cutting out seconds before a crucial take, camera batteries inexplicably draining, a microphone capturing only static, the crew began joking about a jinx on the unmapped market location. The director, amused but perhaps a little wary, began wearing the same shirt whenever they filmed there, claiming it was for continuity. Whether or not it was, the incidents mysteriously stopped after that. The film's music also carries a hidden layer of production history. one of the most evocative tracks, a gentle, almost melancholic piece used during a walking sequence, was built entirely from sounds recorded on set. The soft hum of a refrigerator in the cafe, the faint chatter of market vendors, the rhythmic patter of rain against corrugated metal. The composer treated these ambient noises like instruments, weaving them into a subtle melody that seems to place the audience right inside the city's living pulse. The final scene, an early morning walk through quiet streets, almost didn't happen the way it appears on screen. It had been scheduled for the last day of shooting, but the neighborhood was noisier than expected, with delivery trucks and motorbikes threatening to overwhelm the sound. Then, in an odd twist of fate, a sudden power outage silenced much of the surrounding area for nearly an hour. The crew moved quickly, and the scene was captured in a hushed atmosphere that perfectly matched the emotional tone. When the production wrapped, there was no grand wrap party. Instead, cast and crew gathered at the cafe that had become the story's unofficial heart. The owner, who had started the shoot as a reluctant host, stood up during the small toast and said that the film had brought good noise into his life. That phrase stuck with the crew, some of whom began calling the entire shoot the Good Noise Project when they reminisced in later years. Even now, decades later, the people who worked on it recall the shoot not just for the finished film, but for the feeling of being part of something that unfolded in its own time, at its own pace, in places that didn't always want to be found. It was a production that embraced unpredictability, not because it wanted to, but because the story demanded it. And in the end, all those accidents, coincidences, and compromises became part of the film's texture, inseparable from the scenes they helped create. It's easy to watch the film now and see it as a fully formed piece of work, its moments carefully arranged, its moods deliberate. But knowing the stories behind those moments, the radios that refused to be silenced, the rain that came uninvited, the market that rearranged itself overnight, makes the viewing richer. It reminds you that cinema, at its best, isn't about control. It's about what happens when preparation meets the unplanned, when the camera captures not just what was in the script, but what life itself decided to add. The world of the film is not presented to us as a backdrop. It breathes, shifts, and leans into the story until it feels like another character entirely. Every setting has its own pulse, its own history etched into walls, streets, and shadows. From the first frame to the last, the locations are chosen with such precision that you could strip away the dialogue, mute the sound, and still understand the emotional journey unfolding. It begins in a modest apartment, the kind of space that wears its years quietly. The paint on the walls is sun-faded, with faint cracks tracing lazy lines toward the ceiling. A small window looks out onto a slice of the city, where rooftops seem to fold over one another like overlapping pages. This is where we first meet her, bathed in soft dawn light, the world outside still drowsy. The set design here is a study in restraint. A single plant in the corner, a few worn books stacked on a table, a chair that creaks under the slightest weight. Nothing in the frame is accidental. Each detail tells us about her life, a life that has been carefully measured, one that prioritizes function over indulgence. The stillness of the apartment mirrors the guardedness of its occupant, a space that holds back as much as it reveals. From here, the film flows into the marketplace, and suddenly the stillness is gone. The market is a labyrinth of stalls, each one spilling with color and texture, ripe mangoes piled high in wicker baskets, fish gleaming on slabs of melting ice, bolts of fabric draped over wooden beams. The air is thick with a mix of scents, grilled meat, damp earth, diesel fumes, and the soundscape is alive with competing voices, laughter, haggling, the clang of a metal cleaver. This is the city in its most unfiltered form, and the cinematography revels in its chaos. The camera doesn't simply point and record. It weaves through the crowd like another body, slipping between strangers, catching snippets of overheard conversation. The movement here is kinetic, handheld shots giving the sense that we're inside the swirl of daily life, rather than observing it from a safe distance. Then there is the cafe, a setting that feels like the narrative's heartbeat. It's a small, dimly lit space tucked between two repair shops, the kind of place you could walk past 100 times without noticing. The walls are lined with old photographs, their edges curling with age, and the constant hum of vintage radios fills the air with a soft, unpredictable crackle. This space is intimate, almost conspiratorial, the light falling in warm pools across tabletops while the corners remain in shadow. Cinematically, the cafe is where the film slows down, where close-ups dominate and every micro-expression is amplified. The sound design here is delicate. You hear the stir of a spoon in coffee, the low murmur of a voice, the faint hiss of steam from behind the counter. It is here that conversations shift from casual to confessional, where silences carry as much weight as words. The docks form another crucial setting, but unlike the warmth of the cafe, they are stark and exposed. Wide shots dominate here, the expanse of open space making the characters seem small against the backdrop of corrugated warehouses and still water. The color palette shifts to muted blues and grays, the sky often overcast, and the air feels heavy with the scent of salt and rust. There's a quiet menace in this space, no bustling crowd to blend into, no intimate corners to retreat to. When the key confrontation unfolds here, the emptiness amplifies every word, every pause. The cinematography uses negative space like a weapon, letting the gaps between people become as charged as the dialogue itself. The streets of the neighborhood are the connective tissue between these primary locations, and they're treated with equal care. Narrow alleys lined with laundry-draped windows, children playing barefoot in the dust, stray dogs weaving between motorbikes. These transitional moments are never just filler. The camera often lingers on them longer than expected, as if to remind us that life is happening all around the central drama. The cinematographer favors natural light for these shots, allowing the warm glow of late afternoon or the sharp silver of early morning to wash over the scene, creating a rhythm that reflects the passing of time in a way the dialogue never directly addresses. Rain plays its own role in shaping the atmosphere. In scenes where uncertainty or vulnerability takes center stage, the rain is not just a visual effect but a texture, softening edges and blurring the boundaries between characters and their surroundings. The droplets catch light in ways that make the air itself seem charged, and reflections in puddles double the visual space, hinting at unseen depths. Sometimes the rain is natural, sometimes created by rigs, but always it is filmed with an intimacy that makes it feel like part of the character's inner landscapes. The interiors are as telling as the exteriors. The antagonist's presence is often marked by spaces that feel slightly off balance, a cramped office where the blinds never open fully, a dim hallway where the overhead bulb flickers. These settings are subtly oppressive, the framing often tight, forcing characters into the edge of the frame or cutting them off at the shoulders. The visual language here is deliberate. When he enters a space, the camera mirrors his intrusion, making the audience feel the constriction alongside the characters. Lighting choices throughout the film are a masterclass in mood creation. The protagonist's apartment is bathed in soft, indirect light, reflective of her cautious openness, while the market bursts with high-contrast brightness that throws every detail into sharp relief. The cafe, in contrast, is a world of shadows and amber glow, the kind of light that invites secrets. At the docks, the light is often flat and cool, stripping away romance and leaving only the raw contours of the scene. This interplay between warmth and coolness, light and shadow, isn't just aesthetic, it reflects the emotional temperature of each setting. The use of framing is equally deliberate. In the market, the camera often places the protagonist in partial obstruction, behind stacks of produce, framed through gaps in hanging cloth, suggesting her tendency to observe rather than fully engage. In the cafe, she is framed tightly, her face filling the screen, signaling intimacy and vulnerability. At the docks, the framing pulls back, letting the space dwarf the characters, underscoring the isolation and exposure of that moment. Sound plays a vital role in how these settings breathe. The market's cacophony is layered, each sound distinct but never overwhelming, creating a sensory overload that matches the visual busyness. The cafe's soundscape is sparse, every clink and shuffle amplified by the quiet. The docks are dominated by the distant lap of water and the occasional cry of a gull, sounds that make the silences between words feel even heavier. Even the apartment has its own sonic fingerprint, the faint hum of a fridge, the occasional honk from the street below, the whisper of fabric as she moves through her routines. Color grading ties these spaces together while allowing each to retain its own personality. The market scenes are saturated, full of reds, yellows, and greens that pulse with life. The cafe leans toward warm browns and deep shadows, enveloping the viewer in a cocoon of intimacy. The docks are desaturated, almost monochrome, as if the color has been drained by the weight of the moment. The transitions between these palettes are smooth but intentional, guiding the audience's emotional state without them consciously realizing it. One of the film's quiet triumphs is how it uses these settings not as static backdrops, but as evolving mirrors of the characters' journeys. The apartment in the early scenes feels closed and cautious, but by the final act, subtle changes, a window left open, light streaming in more freely, suggest an internal shift. The market, once a place of anonymity, becomes a space where chance encounters feel like possibilities rather than intrusions. Even the docks, site of the most charged confrontation, are revisited in memory through a softened lens, their menace replaced by a sense of resolved tension. By the time the final scene unfolds, a slow walk through streets at dawn, the the city itself feels transformed. The same streets we've seen before are now bathed in a gentler light, their edges softened, the air less crowded. The cinematography lingers on details, a shopkeeper sweeping his front step, the glow of a street lamp fading in the growing daylight, the quiet rhythm of footsteps in sync. The setting here isn't just a place. It's a state of mind, reflecting the characters, quiet acceptance of what lies ahead. In the end, the film's locations and cinematic elements work in seamless harmony, each choice, whether in light, color, framing, or sound, serving both story and character. The settings do more than hold the narrative. They shape it, absorb it, and return it to us imbued with emotional resonance. And when the credits roll, it's not just the characters we remember, it's the feeling of those spaces, the way they seem to inhale and exhale alongside the people who moved through them, the way they held the story like a confidant, quietly, steadfastly, until the very last frame. Long before the first clapboard snapped shut on set, there was a hum of anticipation that could be felt in every department. This wasn't just another production for most of the crew, it was the kind of film that everyone seemed to believe in from the ground up. Maybe it was the script, maybe it was the director's quietly contagious conviction, but even during the earliest pre-production meetings, you could see in people's eyes that they felt they were building something worth protecting. The first read-through took place in the cramped conference room of a small production office, the kind where the hum of the air conditioner is almost louder than the voices in the room. The cast sat around a rectangular table, coffee cups scattered between them, scripts thick with sticky notes. The director encouraged interruptions, inviting the actors to question dialogue, to bend lines into something that felt truer to the characters. By the end of the day, a few scenes had been completely reworked, stripped of unnecessary exposition, and rebuilt around pauses, glances, and unsaid words. It was here, in this unglamorous space, that the first threads of real chemistry began to form between the leads. On set, the atmosphere was a strange balance of intensity and playfulness. The market scenes were the most unpredictable to shoot, not because of the cast or crew, but because of the market itself. Real vendors continued to operate during filming, sometimes weaving right into frame without realizing. The assistant director kept a stack of printed flyers to hand out, explaining they were shooting a movie and asking for cooperation, but even then, the life of the market would spill in unexpectedly. One day, a fishmonger shouted a dramatic sales pitch just as the camera rolled on a tense exchange between the leads. Everyone expected the director to call cut, but instead he waved for the cinematographer to keep rolling. That single moment, absurdly enough, ended up in the final cut. It became a small, grounding detail that reminded viewers the story was anchored in a living, breathing world. The cafe location brought its own kind of challenges. Because the owner refused to turn off his vintage radios, the sound crew had to work with the constant risk of static bleeding into the audio. At first, this drove the sound recordist half mad, but slowly, the team began to treat the static as part of the soundscape. Sometimes they would even wait for a faint burst to coincide with a dramatic pause, letting it punctuate the moment. Between takes, the cafe became a sanctuary for the crew. They would sip coffee from the real counter, huddling at the same tables the characters sat at, flipping through their call sheets while the owner told stories about the neighborhood. One of the most unexpected bonds to form on set was between the cinematographer and the lead actress. They developed a kind of unspoken language during filming. A raised eyebrow or subtle hand gesture from behind the camera could tell her to hold her position just a second longer, to let the light shift across her face before moving. In quieter scenes, the crew would notice them almost moving in sync. She'd adjust her pacing as the camera tracked, and the camera would adjust its framing as she breathed. It gave those scenes a fluidity that couldn't have been planned on paper. There were, of course, the inevitable challenges. The dockside sequence was a logistical nightmare from the start. Filming permits only covered certain hours, and the weather was unpredictable. On the first night, a thick fog rolled in just as they were ready to shoot, swallowing the lights and muting the backdrop into a blank canvas. Instead of scrapping the night, the director decided to lean into it, reshaping the blocking so that the fog became part of the scene's tension. The antagonist's silhouette emerging slowly from that white mist ended up being one of the most haunting images in the film, a moment born entirely from circumstance. Perhaps the most bizarre on-set occurrence was the sudden appearance of a stray dog during the dock confrontation. The crew had been rehearsing the scene all day, perfecting every angle, when the animal trotted right into the middle of a take and stopped between the two actors. Everyone froze, expecting someone to shoo it away, but the actors never broke character. They stared each other down. The dog glanced up at them as if weighing their standoff, then wandered out of frame. The director laughed for a solid minute before declaring that the take was too good to lose. It stayed in the final edit, and to this day, fans sometimes ask if the dog was trained. It wasn't, it was just a piece of life strolling into fiction. Between the heavier moments, the set was far from solemn. The male lead had a habit of breaking the tension by improvising exaggerated versions of his lines between takes, sending the crew into fits of laughter. In one instance, during a break in filming at the cafe, he mimicked the director's famously slow way of giving notes, pausing dramatically after every other word. The director, standing just behind him, joined in the act, turning the whole exchange into a playful performance that had the grip crew struggling to keep steady hands on the equipment. Props became their own behind-the-scenes characters. The letter, an important piece of the narrative, was fiercely protected by the lead actress. She refused to let the prop department replace it with fresh duplicates, insisting that the creases, smudges, and faint ink fading were part of her connection to it. One night during an outdoor shoot, the letter got damp, and the ink began to run. The art department spent hours under a single work light, delicately recreating the text by hand using reference stills from earlier scenes. From then on, someone was always assigned to letter duty to make sure it was stored in a waterproof envelope between takes. There was also the matter of the jinxed location, the unmapped section of the market where several small mishaps kept happening. One day, the camera batteries drained mysteriously after being fully charged. Another day, the generator cut out seconds before the best take of the morning. After the third incident, the crew started joking that the place didn't want to be filmed. The director, who didn't believe in such things, nonetheless wore the same blue shirt every time they returned to that spot. He called it continuity, but everyone knew it had quietly become a superstition. Strangely enough, the mishaps stopped after that. Rain days were a mixed blessing. There was one scene scheduled for a drizzle, but the skies opened up into a full storm. Instead of canceling, the director reimagined the scene to embrace the heavier rainfall, resulting in a visually striking sequence where characters walked through sheets of water, their voices nearly drowned out by the sound. It was miserable for the actors, soaked to the bone in unheated conditions, but the footage was stunning, and even they admitted later that it had been worth it. When the final scene rolled around, a dawn walk through empty streets, the crew was running on both exhaustion and adrenaline. They had only a narrow window to capture the soft, diffused light before the city fully woke. Just as they were setting up, a sudden power outage swept through the neighborhood. The traffic noise died down, the neon signs went dark, and the world fell into a rare, delicate quiet. They shot the scene in that silence, the characters' footsteps echoing more clearly than any line of dialogue could. It was as if the city itself had paused to let them finish. When filming wrapped, there was no flashy afterparty. Instead, the cast and crew returned to the cafe for one last gathering. The owner, who had started as a cautious host, raised a glass and thanked them for bringing good noise to his place. They stayed late into the night, sharing stories of the shoot, about the stubborn radios, the wandering dog, the fog at the docks, and the jinxed market. Someone suggested they should reunite years later in the same spot, to see how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Looking back, what stands out about the shoot isn't just the finished scenes, but the way life kept folding itself into the film. Some of the most memorable moments weren't scripted, planned, or even welcome at first. They were accidents, interruptions, small acts of unpredictability, but rather than fight them, the crew embraced them. They trusted the story enough to let it breathe, to let the real world leave its fingerprints on it. That's why, when you watch the film closely, there's a texture to it that feels different from other productions of its time. You're not just seeing a crafted narrative, you're catching glimpses of the people who built it, the laughter between takes, the quick problem-solving under pressure, the coffee shared between setups. You're seeing a story that was shaped not only by what was on the page, but by the hands, hearts, and quirks of everyone who brought it to life. At its heart, the film is a meditation on survival, but not the kind that demands grand acts of heroism or cinematic sacrifice. Here, survival is quieter, almost invisible to those who aren't looking closely. It lives in the way someone learns to navigate familiar streets without being seen, in the unspoken calculations behind when to speak and when to remain silent, in the small acts of preservation that never make it into the history books. Every frame seems to pulse with this idea, that to endure in certain worlds requires an artistry all its own. The central theme that rises above the others is the tension between agency and circumstance. The protagonist's life is not defined by a single tragedy or a singular ambition. Instead, it is a series of choices and compromises, moments when she either bends to the weight of her surroundings or quietly reshapes them to fit her needs. The film resists the temptation to make this into a clean arc of victim becomes hero. Instead, It honors the complexity of existing within structures that don't offer easy exits. Agency here isn't about dominating one's environment. It's about finding slivers of space where one can stand without being crushed. This theme is given shape through the repeated motif of thresholds. Doorways, windows, market stalls, spaces that are neither entirely inside nor outside, recur throughout the film. They become visual metaphors for her existence on the boundary between safety and exposure, between anonymity and recognition. When we first meet her, she's framed by the window in her apartment, watching the street but not stepping into it. Later, she's often filmed passing through markets or doorways, the camera lingering just long enough to suggest that these transitions are significant, that every movement from one space into another carries a risk and a choice. Another theme, woven more subtly, is the idea of intimacy as both sanctuary and vulnerability. The cafe serves as the film's primary symbolic space for this. It is warm, enclosed, lit in amber tones that soften even the sharpest features. Here she speaks more freely, reveals fragments of herself without the immediate threat of judgment or consequence. Yet even in this sanctuary, there is risk, sharing too much, trusting too deeply. The cafe becomes a kind of emotional testing ground, a place where she can inch toward openness without fully abandoning her protective distance. The warm light is not just aesthetic. It's a visual representation of the tentative safety that intimacy offers. Water imagery, particularly in the docks and rain sequences, carries its own symbolic weight. Rain is almost always present at turning points in the story, its steady patter creating a veil between characters and their surroundings. It blurs edges, distorts outlines, and makes the world feel slightly more malleable. In the dockside confrontation, the water is still, heavy, reflecting the immovability of the situation, two forces meeting in a space where retreat is as difficult as advance. In a later rain scene, the downpour is so heavy it nearly obscures the characters, symbolizing how moments of change can wash away clarity, leaving only instinct to guide the next step. The antagonist embodies a different symbolic function, the persistence of the past. He doesn't just represent a personal threat, he's the physical manifestation of history, refusing to dissolve. His appearances are framed in ways that disrupt space, standing in doorways, blocking paths, casting shadows that stretch beyond his immediate presence. The cinematography often traps the protagonist in tighter frames when he's near, compressing the visual space to make the audience feel the same constriction she does. He is less a man than a reminder that the past is not always something one can walk away from. Sometimes, it follows. Light and shadow play an almost subconscious role in developing these themes. Early in the film, shadows dominate her apartment, the light muted and indirect. In the market, light is harsh and fragmented, cutting through tarps and awnings in uneven patches, mirroring the unpredictability of her daily existence. The cafe, in contrast, is saturated in consistent warmth, hinting at the possibility of stability. As the story progresses, these lighting patterns subtly shift. Her apartment grows brighter, the market's light less jarring, the cafe's glow deeper. By the time the final scene arrives, dawn spills openly into the streets, bathing both characters in a shared light that didn't exist in the opening frames. There is also a recurrent visual motif involving hands, hers in particular. In quiet moments, the camera lingers on her fingers brushing over objects, folding the letter, tracing the rim of a coffee cup. Hands become a stand-in for the things she cannot say. They reveal tension, restlessness, and sometimes tenderness long before her face does. The letter scene, for example, is less about the words she writes and more about the deliberate way she folds the paper afterward, as though sealing something too fragile for the outside world. The audience comes to read these gestures as another language, one rooted in the body rather than speech. The film also explores the theme of connection versus isolation. The city is depicted as both a protective cloak and a suffocating cage. Crowds can hide you, but they can also erase you. In the market, she moves like a shadow among others, her anonymity her shield. In the cafe, she is singular and seen. The docks, in their openness, strip away both anonymity and crowd, leaving only the stark reality of confrontation. The interplay between these spaces mirrors her emotional journey, shifting between hiding, revealing, and facing what must be faced. Symbolism extends even to the smallest props. The letter, which appears in multiple scenes, becomes an anchor for her interior life. It's not just paper and ink, it's the one place she allows herself to articulate what she can't voice aloud. Its repeated presence reminds us that her story is not just about external conflict, but about the private act of defining oneself. The fact that the letter remains with her until the end is a quiet declaration that some parts of her identity are non-negotiable, no matter how much the outside world shifts. Food and drink also carry symbolic weight, particularly in the cafe scenes. Sharing a cup of coffee becomes shorthand for a willingness to share time, space, and attention. In the market, food is transactional, bought, sold, consumed quickly. In the cafe, it's lingered over, almost ritualistic, signaling that the act of nourishment here is as much emotional as it is physical. The contrast between these two spaces, and how she engages with them, reflects her gradual movement from guarded efficiency to cautious openness. The recurring sound of radios in the cafe is another subtle but potent layer of symbolism. Their constant low crackle, even when the characters are silent, suggests the presence of histories, of stories that exist beyond the frame. Sometimes the static interrupts, reminding us that clarity is never perfect. Sometimes the music they play feels almost eerily in sync with the emotional beats of a scene, as if the world is quietly conspiring to underscore the moment. Even the film's pacing holds symbolic resonance. It refuses the urgency of many dramas, allowing silences and stillness to dominate in places where others would push for action. This deliberate slowness is thematic in itself. It mirrors the protagonist's way of moving through life, considering each step, navigating not in leaps but in careful increments. When moments of sudden action do arrive, they land with greater force precisely because of the measured pace that surrounds them. By the time the film reaches its closing sequence, the accumulation of these symbols creates a kind of visual and emotional tapestry. The dawn walk through quiet streets is not just an ending, it's a summation of everything the story has been building toward. The open light, the unhurried steps, the absence of looming shadows all speak to a shift that is both internal and external. She is still in the same city, still surrounded by the same uncertainties, but the space she moves through feels subtly altered, not because the world has changed, but because she has found a way to inhabit it differently. Ultimately, the film's themes and symbols are inseparable from its plot and characters. Every threshold crossed, every shadow passed through, every drop of rain, every fold of a letter is part of the same language, a language about survival, intimacy, memory, and the quiet courage it takes to remain oneself in the face of forces that would rather see you erased. The story never shouts these truths, but lets them settle in the spaces between words, in the textures of light and sound, in the objects that pass from one hand to another. And when the credits roll, what lingers is not just the memory of what happened, but the sense that we've been allowed to glimpse the unspoken map by which someone navigates a life. It begins where it ends, in the quiet streets, bathed in that soft, forgiving light, the kind that seems to pause time just long enough to let you breathe. When you think back on everything we've explored together, it's impossible not to see how those final images are built from everything that came before. They're not just an ending, they're the sum of choices, accidents, and the unshakable texture of a life lived in the in-between. We've walked through her apartment, where stillness spoke louder than words. We've felt the heat and chaos of the market wrap around us like a tide, shifting and unpredictable. We've sat at that cafe table, the radios murmuring in the background, catching every flicker of expression as light bent gently toward her face. We've stood at the docks, with the air heavy and the sky close, watching moments of confrontation turn into points of no return. Through each of these spaces, the story wove its themes with care, survival not as an act of grand defiance, but as a daily art, learned and refined. We've seen how thresholds, literal and figurative, mark her movements, how intimacy carries both promise and risk, how the presence of the past can be as tangible as a shadow falling across a doorway. The camera never told us what to feel, but it offered enough for us to find ourselves in the corners of her story. We followed her hands as they folded and unfolded the letter, as they rested on the rim of a cup, as they passed through spaces that sometimes welcomed her, sometimes didn't. And in those gestures, we read entire chapters. We've talked about the symbolism threaded into every frame, water as a veil, the markets as a living, shifting organism, the cafe as a warm pocket of safety in a world that doesn't always grant it. We felt the dock's open emptiness press in, the rain soften edges and blur boundaries. We've noticed how light and shadow worked in tandem to tell a parallel story, one that spoke about emotional temperature as much as physical space. And in those choices, we saw the filmmakers speaking a language of images, trusting that the audience could hear what wasn't being said. Behind the scenes, we discovered a different kind of story, one made up of accidents, challenges, and the rare kind of adaptability that can turn a problem into something unforgettable. The fishmonger calling out mid-scene, the stubborn cafe radios that refused to be silenced, becoming part of the film's soundscape, the fog that rolled over the docks, changing the scene's entire tone. The stray dog who wandered into the confrontation and somehow made it feel more human. These weren't planned, but they became inseparable from the finished film. the cast and crew didn't just work around these interruptions. They embraced them, folding them into the film's fabric until they felt intentional. We've also seen how these unplanned moments connected with the careful construction of the setting. The cinematography moved like a participant, never standing at a polite distance. In the market, it slipped between bodies. In the cafe, it lingered over faces. At the docks, it pulled back to let. Space dwarfed the people within it. Every location was chosen for the way it could hold a piece of the story. And when the lighting, color grading, and sound design met those spaces, they shaped the mood in ways the audience could feel even if they couldn't articulate it. The production wasn't without its trials, the weather that refused to align with the schedule, the market that rearranged itself daily, the jinxed location where technical failures kept piling up until superstition dictated a lucky shirt. And yet each challenge somehow gave more to the film than it took away. The rain scene shot in a storm instead of a drizzle, the dawn walk captured during a rare power outage that silenced the neighborhood. These were gifts that couldn't have been scripted. And through it all, the story kept its quiet heart intact. No matter how many layers we peeled back, the film never abandoned its central truth, that the act of existing, of holding one's place in a world that would rather move you along, is itself profound. The protagonist's journey isn't about conquering. It's about learning the map of her own survival and deciding where she can leave her footprints. The letter remains with her, just as the city remains around her, changed and unchanged in equal measure. That's what makes the conclusion so quietly powerful. It's not a swell of music or a dramatic pronouncement that stays with you, it's the walk. The pace is unhurried, the light is open, and the camera allows us to follow without rushing. We've been in these streets before, but they feel different now, softer, like a conversation that no longer needs to be forced. And that's the beauty of the journey we've just taken together. You come out of it feeling like you've been given permission to notice the smallest things again. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, you know by now that this isn't just a film you watch, it's one you feel your way through. You don't leave it with a single takeaway neatly packaged. You leave with a handful of impressions, textures, and questions that you'll turn over long after the credits fade. That's the mark of a story worth revisiting, not because it changes, but because you do. And here's the thing, there are so many more stories like this out there, each carrying its own hidden layers, its own strange alchemy of planned craft and accidental magic. Stories that deserve to be unraveled with the same care, to be held up to the light so we can see what's been stitched into them. If you found yourself lost in this world the way I have, if you've caught yourself holding your breath during a silence or noticing the way a shadow fell just so across someone's face, then you're exactly the kind of person I want to keep doing this with. So before you step out of this story and into the next, take a moment, subscribe, join me again, because there's always another scene to walk into, another hidden detail to find, another moment that will catch you off guard and refuse to let go. Let's keep peeling back the layers together, one frame at a time.